My name is Olivia Reed, and I discovered the ultimate family betrayal at age 27. For nearly a decade, I handed over 60% of my salary to my parents for family expenses, while my younger sister Harper lived completely expense-free. I believed we were struggling financially until I discovered property records that revealed my parents owned 7 investment properties, purchased with my money. What happened next changed everything about our family forever. Before we jump, back in? Tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the moment I realized my childhood would be fundamentally different from my sister's. It was my 14th birthday, and while most kids anticipated gifts or celebration, I received a spiral-bound budget notebook from my father. "It's time you understand how the real world works," he said, placing the notebook before me at our kitchen table. "Your education costs are increasing, and this family needs to operate like a business. Everyone must contribute." My mother nodded. In solemn agreement, though her eyes didn't quite meet mine. At 14, I didn't fully comprehend what contributing meant, but over the next 2 years it became painfully clear. While my friends enjoyed after-school activities and weekend freedom, I found myself working increasingly long hours at Henderson's Grocery, stocking shelves and operating a register with a special work permit for minors. Harper, my sister who was 5 years younger, existed in an entirely different reality within the same household. While I handed over most of my paycheck for household expenses, Harper received dance lessons, a new smartphone, and an extensive wardrobe that made my thrift store clothes look like rags by comparison. "Harper has special needs," my mother would explain whenever I questioned the disparity. "She's sensitive and artistic. Pushing her too hard would crush her spirit." Apparently, my spirit was made of sturdier stuff. By 18, I was contributing 60% of my earnings to my parents while maintaining a 3.8 GPA through sheer determination. I applied to state universities with fervent hope, seeing education as my escape route from a household where I was treated more like a tenant than a daughter. "Your college fund has unfortunately been depleted," my father announced during my senior year, his expression suggesting regretful circumstances beyond his control. "We used it for essential home repairs last year. You'll need to cover your own education expenses." That same month, my parents surprised Harper with a fully funded summer program in Europe to nurture her artistic sensibilities. She was 13, the same age I had been when I started working to contribute to the family. The contrast was stark, but somehow normalized in our household dynamics. My parents didn't present their preferential treatment as malicious. They framed it as practical resource allocation. Harper was gifted and sensitive, requiring investments to flourish. I was responsible and independent, perfectly capable of making my own way. I accepted this narrative for years, internalizing the idea that perhaps I was simply worth less attention, less investment, less consideration. This belief shaped how I navigated relationships, work, and my sense of self-worth. If my own parents saw me primarily as a resource rather than a person deserving nurturing, perhaps that's all I was. State University offered me a partial academic scholarship that covered roughly 40% of my tuition. For the remainder, I worked 2 jobs, one at the university library during weekdays, and another at a 24-hour diner on weekends. Sleep became a luxury, social life almost non-existent. During my sophomore year, I received an unexpected call from my mother on a rare evening when I'd actually scheduled time to attend a campus event. "Olivia, we need to discuss your contribution," she began without preamble. "Your father and I have been reviewing our finances, and with Harper starting her college applications process, we'll need you to increase your monthly payment." I stood outside the student center, watching other students filter in for the keynote speaker I'd been eager to hear. "Mom, I'm barely covering my own expenses. How could I possibly give you more?" "Family requires sacrifice," she replied, her tone suggesting I was being deliberately difficult. Harper needs SAT prep courses, college application fees, and she'll need a laptop for her studies. We're thinking an additional $300 monthly would be reasonable. The casual way she requested nearly half my remaining income after tuition and rent left me momentarily speechless. That's not possible, I finally managed. I'm working 2 jobs already and barely sleeping 4 hours a night. I'm disappointed in your attitude, Olivia. We supported you through childhood, and this is how you repay us? Harper would never be so selfish. The comparison to Harper, who had never worked a day in her life, ignited something in me. Harper is given everything without question. I've been working since I was legally allowed. How exactly is that the same standard? My mother's voice became frigid. We'll discuss this when you're thinking more clearly. Your sister has prospects that require investment. Family means supporting each other's potential. The implication was clear. Harper had potential worth investing in. I was merely a resource to fund that investment. That night marked a turning point in my relationship with my family. I didn't attend the campus event. Instead, I sat on a bench outside the student center for hours, reassessing everything I thought I understood about my place in my family. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge a painful possibility. Perhaps my parents didn't love me and Harper equally. Perhaps I had always been viewed as a means rather than an end, a supporting character in Harper's story rather than the protagonist of my own. This realization, though devastating, proved liberating. If I wasn't going to receive the emotional or financial support typically associated with family, I needed to prioritize my own well-being without guilt. I would continue sending some money home, not the increased amount they requested, but I also opened a separate savings account that my parents couldn't access, depositing a small portion of each paycheck. My academic focus shifted too. Initially pursuing a general business degree because it seemed practical, I now specialized in finance with laser-like intensity. If money was the language my family understood, I would become fluent in it. I attended every workshop on financial literacy, sought mentorship from professors in the field, and devoured resources on investment strategies and wealth building. Professor Jenkins, who taught advanced corporate finance, became a particular ally. Noticing my exceptional dedication, she approached me after class one evening. Most students show interest in finance for the potential salary, she remarked. You approach it like someone searching for answers to a deeply personal question. Her observation was so unexpected and accurate that my carefully maintained composure momentarily fractured. I suppose I am, I admitted. I need to understand how money works because in my family it seems to operate by different rules depending on who's involved. Professor Jenkins nodded thoughtfully, then did something that changed my trajectory significantly. She offered me a position as her research assistant, with a stipend that exceeded both my current jobs combined. You have analytical skills. That can't be taught, she said. And frankly, you look exhausted. This position requires 20 hours weekly with flexible scheduling. You'll learn more applicable skills than you would shelving books or serving coffee. For the first time since beginning university, I reduced my working hours to a manageable level while actually increasing my income. The research position provided not just financial relief, but invaluable mentorship. Professor Jenkins treated me as a colleague with potential rather than a resource to be utilized, a novel experience that gradually began reshaping my sense of self-worth. By my senior year, my separate savings account had grown to nearly $12,000. Not a fortune, but a concrete symbol of my growing independence. Meanwhile, the requests from home continued with increasing frequency and urgency. Harper's been accepted to Westworth University, my father announced during a rare call. The prestige will open doors for her, but the tuition is substantial. We'll need to increase your contribution significantly. Westworth was a private institution with annual costs exceeding $60,000. The audacity of their assumption that I would fund this choice left me momentarily speechless. "I can't afford that," I finally responded. "I'm about to graduate myself, and will have student loans to repay." "This family has always prioritized education," he countered, as if I hadn't worked throughout my own education to fund it. "Harper deserves this opportunity, and as the successful one in the family now, you have a responsibility to help. We're not asking for everything, just $1,500 monthly for the next 4 years." The phrase "the successful one" struck me as particularly manipulative, both flattering and burdening simultaneously. My father had never previously acknowledged any success on my part, but now that it could be leveraged, it suddenly existed. "I need time to think about this," I responded, unwilling to commit to what would amount to over $70,000 over 4 years. "There's nothing to think about," he replied sharply. "This is what family does. Your mother and I sacrificed everything for you children." That night, I created a spreadsheet detailing every dollar I had contributed to my family since age 16. The final figure, over $42,000, stunned me. This didn't include the college fund that had mysteriously disappeared or the emotional cost of years spent prioritizing work over development, relationships, or simple joy. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully feel the anger that had been simmering beneath duty and obligation for over a decade. The disparate treatment wasn't just unfair, it was exploitation disguised as family responsibility. I graduated with honors, secured a position at a financial consulting firm in the city, and moved into a modest apartment with 2 roommates to minimize expenses while building savings. The first month of true independence felt like breathing new air, making decisions based solely on my own needs and goals, rather than constantly calculating what remained after supporting others. This fragile peace lasted exactly 6 weeks before my parents arrived unannounced at my workplace one afternoon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My parents waiting in the reception area of Preston Financial Advisors created an immediate collision of worlds I had carefully kept separate. My father wore his business meeting suit, the one reserved for important occasions, while my mother clutched her designer handbag, the same one she claimed was a necessary investment in appearances during a period when I was told we couldn't afford my wisdom tooth extraction. "Ms. Reed, your visitors are waiting," our receptionist Valerie said with professional discretion, though her raised eyebrow communicated volumes. In our 6 weeks of working together, I had never mentioned family. "Thank you, Valerie. I'll handle this." I led my parents to a small conference room, maintaining the composed demeanor that had already earned me recognition at the firm, despite my junior status. Once the door closed, my father launched immediately into his purpose. "Olivia, we've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your limited responses to our messages are concerning and, frankly, disrespectful." "I've been establishing myself professionally," I replied evenly. "What brings you to my workplace unannounced?" my mother interjected with practiced concern. "We're worried about you, sweetheart. You've become so distant, and we have urgent family matters to discuss." The urgent family matters revealed themselves predictably. Harper's tuition payment was due, the financial aid package was less generous than anticipated, and their credit was unexpectedly tied up in other investments. They needed $21,000 immediately. "We wouldn't ask if it weren't absolutely necessary," my father explained, his tone suggesting this was merely a logistical discussion rather than an extraordinary request. "You're making good money now, and family supports family. We supported you for 18 years. Something in his phrasing, the casual rewriting of history, the implication that my childhood had been a period of generous support rather than early financial conscription, crystallized years of resentment into sudden clarity. "Exactly what support are you referring to?" I asked quietly. "The support where I worked through high school to contribute to household expenses. The support where my college fund mysteriously disappeared while Harper received every advantage? The support where I worked 2 jobs through university while sending money home? My parents exchanged glances that communicated volumes: surprise at my directness, calculation of how to respond, silent coordination of their approach. It was a familiar exchange I'd witnessed throughout childhood whenever I questioned our family's uneven dynamics. "You're twisting things, Olivia," my mother replied, her voice taking on the wounded tone she employed whenever challenged. "We gave you everything we could. Harper simply has different needs." $21,000 is an exceptional need, I observed. "Why come to me rather than using your own resources?" My father straightened his tie, a gesture I recognized as his preparation for what he considered a decisive argument. "Because we're property rich but cash poor at the moment. Our investments are tied up in real estate that we can't liquidate quickly without significant losses. Once the market improves, we'll repay you, of course." This casual mention of multiple real estate investments stopped me cold. Throughout my youth, financial scarcity had been our family's constant companion, or so I had been told. Every request for school supplies, sports participation, or even basic clothing had been met with sighs, calculations, and often denial based on our supposedly limited resources. "What properties?" I asked, my voice controlled despite the thundering heartbeat in my ears. My father waved dismissively. "Just some small investment properties we've acquired over the years. Nothing substantial, but tied up at the moment. The point is, Harper needs this tuition payment, and as family—" "How many properties?" I interrupted, my financial training suddenly very relevant to this conversation. "That's hardly the issue here," my mother interjected. "The point is, 3, 5, more?" I pressed, watching their expressions carefully. My father's jaw tightened, a tell I recognized from childhood whenever he felt cornered. 7 properties, if you must know. Small rentals mostly. Building for retirement. Completely separate from family finances. 7 properties. While I worked overtime to contribute to essential household expenses. While my college fund vanished for emergency repairs. While I took on student debt because there were no resources for my education. "I need you both to leave," I said, standing. "I have clients waiting." "Olivia, you're being completely unreasonable," my mother protested. "We're talking about Harper's future." "And I'm talking about my present," I responded, opening the conference room door. "I'll contact you when I'm ready to discuss this further." After they left, my father stony-faced, my mother oscillating between indignation and theatrical hurt, I closed my office door, pressed my forehead against the cool window glass, and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to process the revelation. Not the betrayal itself, which perhaps I had always suspected on some level, but the breathtaking scale of it. That evening I contacted my friend Zoe, who worked in real estate law. "I need to check property records in Lakeside County," I explained. "Public information, but I don't know the process." "Simple public records search," she replied. "I can pull that information in minutes." "What are you looking for?" "Properties owned by Jonathan and Diane Reed." The records arrived in my inbox 3 hours later. 7 properties indeed. 3 purchased during my high school years exactly when my contributions began. 2 more acquired during my university period when the financial demands intensified, and the most recent 2 purchased within months of Harper's acceptance to Westworth. The market values totaled just over $2. $1 million. More damning than the properties themselves were the mortgage documents. Each showed healthy down payments ranging from $30,000 to $45,000, sums that aligned precisely with periods when my financial contributions to the family had been highest. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. My parents hadn't been struggling financially. They had been using me as an unwitting investor in their real estate portfolio while simultaneously denying me basic support and opportunities. I spent the weekend in a state of focused calculation, employing every analytical skill I had developed professionally. I created spreadsheets documenting my contributions, mapped them against property acquisition dates, and compiled a comprehensive financial history of my relationship with my family. By Sunday evening, I had confirmed what I suspected. Approximately 80% of my lifetime earnings that had gone to my parents correlated directly with their property down payments and renovation expenses. Additionally, the emergency that had eliminated my college fund coincided perfectly with the purchase of their largest investment property, a fourplex near the university that generated substantial monthly income. Monday morning, I requested a meeting with Marian Hayes, the senior partner who had hired me. I rarely sought her direct attention, preferring to prove myself through results rather than relationship building. "Olivia," she greeted me. "This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" I placed my meticulously prepared folder on her desk. "I need your advice on a personal financial matter that may have legal implications." Her eyebrows raised slightly as she reviewed my documentation. "This is quite thorough," she commented after several minutes. "You believe your parents systematically misrepresented their financial situation to extract funds from you, which they then used for investment properties?" "The evidence suggests that," I confirmed. "My question is whether I have any legal recourse to recover these funds." Marian removed her glasses, studying me with the penetrating gaze that had earned her reputation as one of the sharpest financial minds in the industry. "Legally, it's complicated. Much of this occurred when you were a legal adult making voluntary contributions. However," she tapped my spreadsheets thoughtfully, "this pattern is troubling, particularly the college fund aspect, which was presumably established for your benefit when you were a minor. That could potentially constitute fiduciary misconduct." She replaced her glasses, her expression softening slightly. "May I ask why you've brought this to me, rather than directly to a lawyer?" The question caught me off guard. In truth, I hadn't fully examined my own motivations for seeking Marian's counsel specifically. "You've built your career helping people make strategic financial decisions," I finally responded. "This situation requires both financial and strategic thinking. I don't simply want legal justice. I want to make the optimal decision for my future." Marian nodded slowly. "Wise approach. Legal battles are expensive, emotionally draining, and rarely provide complete satisfaction. Sometimes the best revenge is making superior decisions moving forward." She studied the property documentation again. "These are actually decent investments, objectively speaking. Your parents showed good judgment in their selections, if abysmal ethics in their financing methods." Her observation sparked something unexpected in me. Not just anger at the exploitation, but recognition of a certain irony. My parents had inadvertently given me a master class in real estate investment through their actions, an education I could now use for my own benefit. "What would you do in my position?" I asked directly. Marian considered this carefully. "I would approach this as both a business and personal problem. On the business side, I'd secure my financial independence completely before taking any action. On the personal side," she paused, choosing her words deliberately, "I'd recognize that no financial resolution will heal the fundamental breach of trust. That requires separate work, or the decision that some relationships aren't worth repairing." Her advice crystallized something I had been circling intuitively. The revelation about the properties wasn't just about money. It was about recognizing a pattern of exploitation disguised as family obligation that had shaped my entire identity. The financial aspect was simply the most concrete manifestation of a much deeper problem. "Thank you," I said, gathering my documentation. "This has been extremely helpful." "Olivia," Marian called as I reached the door. "For what it's worth, your analysis of this situation shows exceptional clarity under emotionally challenging circumstances. That's a rare quality in this business. That evening, I crafted a carefully worded email to my parents. No accusations, no emotional language, simply a request for a meeting at their home the following Saturday to discuss Harper's education and family financial planning. The neutral phrasing was deliberate, giving no indication of what I had discovered. In the days leading up to that meeting, I continued my research and preparation with methodical precision. I consulted discreetly with a real estate attorney to understand my legal position. I gathered additional property records and income projections. Most importantly, I examined my own financial position and formulated a plan that would prioritize my independence regardless of how the confrontation unfolded. By Saturday morning, I felt a strange calm, not the absence of emotion, but rather its channeling into purposeful action. The young woman who had accepted unequal treatment as somehow deserved had been replaced by someone who understood both her value and her options with crystal clarity. As I drove to my parents' home, the modest suburban house that had concealed their growing real estate empire, I realized that regardless of how they responded, I had already achieved the most important victory. I had reclaimed my narrative and my future from patterns established in childhood. The financial resolution mattered, but the personal revelation mattered more. The real estate holdings had changed everything, not just my understanding of the past, but my vision for what might be possible in my future once freed from artificial limitations and misplaced guilt. For that clarity, ironically, I had my parents to thank. The familiar drive to my parents' house felt surreal, like returning to a childhood home only to find everything slightly smaller than memory suggested. The meticulously maintained lawn, the carefully pruned shrubs, the seasonal wreath on the front door, all elements of the image my parents had cultivated of responsible middle-class propriety. An image I now understood concealed a very different reality. I parked behind my father's sensible sedan, another calculated choice that projected modest success without ostentation. The garage door was partially open, revealing glimpses of storage boxes labeled with my name. Childhood possessions I'd never been allowed to take to my apartment because they were being saved for sentimental reasons. More likely, I realized, now, they were being held as leverage, physical ties to ensure emotional ones remained intact. My mother answered the door before I could knock, her expression a practiced blend of warmth and subtle martyrdom. "Olivia, we were beginning to wonder if you were coming. Your father just put on coffee." She ushered me inside with the practiced hospitality she extended to neighbors and colleagues, polite but measured, as if conserving true warmth for more deserving recipients. My father sat at the dining room table, papers arranged in neat stacks before him. The organization was familiar, his method of establishing authority in financial discussions since my childhood. He would present figures and outcomes as inevitable conclusions rather than choices made with particular priorities in mind. "Right on time," he noted, checking his watch, a gesture that had intimidated me in youth but now struck me as theatrical. "We've prepared some options for Harper's tuition that I think you'll find reasonable." I took a seat across from him, declining the coffee my mother offered. "Before we discuss Harper's situation, I'd like to talk about the family's overall financial picture." My father smiled indulgently. "I understand your professional interest, but our broader finances aren't relevant to the immediate need. Harper's tuition. 7 investment properties are entirely relevant," I interrupted calmly, placing a folder on the table between us. "Particularly when their acquisition dates align precisely with periods when my contributions to this household increased." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother, returning from the kitchen, froze midway to the table. My father's expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and finally something approaching respect, though not remorse. "You've been investigating us?" My mother's voice carried genuine shock, as if the violation was my research rather than their years of deception. "I've been investigating public records, I corrected. Property ownership isn't private information. My father leaned back, reassessing me with the gaze of someone encountering an unexpected competitor rather than a daughter. Those investments are separate from household finances, he stated, though with less conviction than before. I opened my folder and removed a color-coded timeline I had created. This chart shows my financial contributions to this household from age 16 to present. The red markers indicate when each property was purchased. The blue indicators show major cash infusions from me to you, college fund liquidation, increased monthly payments, and special emergency requests. I slid the document toward them. The correlation is statistically improbable if these were unrelated financial streams. My contributions didn't support household expenses. They funded your real estate investments. My mother's face had lost color. My father's jaw tightened in the way it always did when his authority was challenged. We used available resources to secure the family's future, he stated flatly. Which family members exactly? I asked. Because while I was working double shifts to send money home, Harper never had a job. While my college fund disappeared into the down payment for the Lakeside fourplex, Harper received full financial support for education and extracurriculars. Your sister has different needs. Yes, I've heard that explanation for 13 years, I finished for him. What I haven't heard is why her needs consistently required my resources rather than yours. My mother found her voice, though. It wavered slightly. We've given you everything we could, Olivia. You've always been so capable, so independent. I became independent because I had no choice. I corrected her. That's not a natural character trait. It was a survival adaptation to being treated as a resource rather than a daughter. The brutal honesty silenced her momentarily. My father shifted strategies. I understand you're upset about the properties, but this doesn't change Harper's immediate need. Westworth's tuition can be paid from the approximately $18,000 monthly income your properties generate. I completed his sentence again, referencing another document from my folder. According to county rental averages and the units in your buildings, that's the conservative estimate of your gross rental income. My father's expression hardened. Those properties have mortgages, maintenance costs, property taxes, which still leave approximately $8,500 monthly in net income, I continued, more than adequate to cover Harper's tuition without additional contributions from me. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, I watched my father mentally recalibrating his approach. The practiced financial narratives that had shaped our family dynamics for years had suddenly collapsed against documented facts and precise calculations. Olivia, he began, his tone modulating to one I recognized from his negotiations with business associates. I understand this information feels surprising. But these investments were always intended to benefit the entire family eventually. Your mother and I simply recognized opportunities that required immediate action. When exactly would the entire family begin benefiting? I asked. Because so far, the investment benefits have flowed in one direction, while the contribution requirements have flowed in another. When you have children of your own, you'll understand that parents sometimes make complicated choices for the greater good, my mother interjected, reaching for the moral high ground that had previously been her refuge. The greater good would have included transparency, I replied evenly, and equal opportunities for both daughters. My father leaned forward, abandoning pretense for a more direct approach. What exactly do you want from this conversation, Olivia? If it's acknowledgement that we prioritized Harper's needs over yours at times, then yes, we made those choices deliberately. We stand by them. His candor, however callous, was almost refreshing after years of evasion and manipulation. It confirmed what I had long suspected, but never heard stated so plainly. The unequal treatment wasn't accidental, but intentional. What I want is threefold, I responded, maintaining the businesslike tone that seemed to be the only language my father truly respected. First, complete transparency about how my contributions were used. Second, acknowledgement that the narrative of family financial struggle was manufactured to facilitate my continued contributions. And third, a restructuring of family financial responsibilities moving forward. My mother looked bewildered, but my father nodded slowly, recognizing the framework of a negotiation. And what does this restructuring entail in your view? I will no longer contribute to household expenses or Harper's education, I stated. Additionally, I believe I'm entitled to partial ownership interest in the properties my money helped purchase, particularly the Lakeside fourplex, which was acquired using my college fund. The flash of alarm in my father's eyes confirmed I had struck a vulnerable point. That's completely unreasonable, he began, but his objection lacked his usual conviction. Actually, it's quite reasonable from both a financial and ethical perspective, I countered. A real estate attorney would likely consider it a conservative request given the circumstances. My other option would be pursuing full financial recovery of misappropriated funds, which would necessitate a more adversarial legal approach. The implied legal threat shifted the dynamic immediately. My father, ever practical about financial matters, recognized the potential costs, both monetary and reputational, of such proceedings. We should discuss this privately before responding, he said to my mother, who looked increasingly distressed. Of course, I agreed, rising from the table. I'll step outside for 15 minutes to give you time to confer. The spring air felt cleansing as I walked the perimeter of the backyard where I had played as a child. The swing set was long gone, replaced by an ornamental garden that required professional maintenance, another expense that had somehow been affordable despite the household's supposed financial limitations. I felt oddly calm despite the confrontation unfolding inside. The anger that had initially fueled my investigation had been transformed through the process of documentation and analysis into something more powerful: clarity. I no longer sought emotional validation or parental approval, merely appropriate financial alignment based on factual history. When I returned to the dining room, my parents had composed themselves. My father spoke first. We're prepared to discuss a reasonable arrangement regarding the lakeside property, he stated. However, we believe your characterization of our intentions is unnecessarily harsh. Everything we've done has been for this family's collective benefit, including telling me my college fund had been depleted for emergency repairs when it was actually used as a down payment on an investment property, I asked. We intended to replenish that fund, my mother interjected quickly. The investment was supposed to generate returns that would have covered your education and more. Yet, when those returns materialized, they were directed toward Harper's expenses rather than replacing my fund, I noted. The pattern is consistent throughout our financial history. My resources were treated as communal, while Harper's needs were treated as priority investments. My father sighed with calculated weariness. What specific arrangement would resolve this situation to your satisfaction? Transfer 40% ownership of the Lakeside fourplex to me, I stated. That property was purchased primarily with my college fund, which constituted approximately that percentage of the acquisition cost. I'll assume proportional responsibility for expenses moving forward and receive proportional income. The percentage was deliberate, high enough to represent meaningful compensation, but not so high as to trigger outright rejection. My father considered the proposal with the attention he gave to consequential business decisions. 20%, he countered, with gradual increase to 30% over 5 years, contingent on your participation in property management. 35% immediately, I responded, with no management obligations unless compensated separately at market rates for such services, and written acknowledgement that all future family financial discussions will include complete transparency regarding resource allocation. We had entered the familiar territory of negotiation, where my father felt comfortable and competent. What he didn't seem to recognize was that this process, reducing family relationships to transactional terms, revealed exactly why we had reached this point. After further discussion and counteroffers, we settled on 30% ownership transferred immediately, with potential for incremental increases based on future capital contributions if I chose to make them. Additional provisions included regular financial disclosures regarding property operations and explicit acknowledgement that I had no financial obligations toward Harper's education or expenses. As my father drafted the terms for later formalization, by attorneys, my mother watched with an expression of bewildered loss. The family dynamic she had helped engineer, one daughter as contributor, the other as beneficiary, was fundamentally altered, and she seemed genuinely unable to comprehend how we had arrived at this point. "This feels so cold," she finally said, "dividing things like business partners instead of family." "The business relationship was established long ago," I replied quietly. "I'm simply acknowledging its terms rather than continuing to mistake it for something else." When the meeting concluded, I declined their invitation to stay for dinner. The conversational pleasantries that would normally disguise our fundamental disconnection held no appeal. As I prepared to leave, Harper arrived home unexpectedly, her semester break apparently starting earlier than I'd been told. She entered, with the casual entitlement I recognized from years of watching her move through a world arranged for her convenience. Her surprise at seeing me quickly transformed to animation. "Olivia, perfect timing. I need your help choosing between summer programs. There's an amazing art history intensive in Florence, but also this incredible architectural design workshop in Barcelona. They're both just, impossible to choose." The oblivious assumption that I would naturally be invested in this decision, perhaps even financially, momentarily stunned me. Harper had been as much a product of our parents' system as I had been, shaped by different expectations and afforded different opportunities until these roles seemed natural rather than constructed. "I'm afraid I can't help with that decision," I replied simply, "but I wish you luck with whatever you choose." Her confusion was genuine. "But you always help me with the big decisions." "Things are changing," I said, glancing toward our parents. "Ask Mom and Dad about the new financial arrangements we've just discussed. I think you'll find some adjustments will be necessary in various areas." As I drove away from my childhood home, I felt neither triumph nor vindication, just the quiet certainty that comes from aligning external circumstances with internal truth. The property records had indeed changed everything, not by revealing something entirely unknown, but by providing incontrovertible evidence of patterns I had sensed but couldn't previously prove. The real freedom wasn't in the financial arrangement. We had negotiated, though that represented meaningful progress. The true liberation was in finally abandoning the narrative that had been constructed around my role in the family. The story that cast my exploitation as responsibility, my needs as secondary, and my contributions as obligations rather than choices. I was no longer the supporting character in someone else's story. I had reclaimed the authorship of my own. The transfer of partial ownership in the lakeside fourplex materialized more quickly than I expected. Perhaps my father recognized that. Delaying would only create opportunities for legal complications, or perhaps he respected the business-like approach I had taken to resolving our conflict. Regardless of his motivations, within 3 weeks, I received formal documentation confirming my 30% ownership interest in the property that had been purchased with my college fund. What I hadn't anticipated was how this tangible asset would transform my financial trajectory. During our next meeting at Preston Financial, Marion Hayes reviewed my updated portfolio with raised eyebrows. "Real estate ownership changes your financial profile significantly," she noted, analyzing my updated statements. "Particularly income-generating. Property in a prime location. This creates opportunities for leveraging existing equity toward additional investments." I hadn't considered that aspect, I admitted. The property had represented justice rather than opportunity in my calculations. Restitution, rather than foundation. Marion smiled slightly. That's the interesting thing about financial assets. Their value extends beyond the emotional or historical circumstances of their acquisition. This property has potential regardless of how you came to own it. Her observation triggered a realization that would fundamentally alter my approach. Moving forward, I had been so focused on rectifying past exploitation that I hadn't fully considered how to optimize future opportunities. The partial ownership wasn't just symbolic victory, it was genuine financial leverage. I'd like to understand how to maximize this asset's potential, I said, shifting from retrospective justice to prospective strategy, both as passive income and as foundation for future investments. Over the following months, I immersed myself in real estate investment education with the same intensity I had previously applied to documenting my family's financial history. I attended industry seminars, cultivated relationships with experienced investors, and systematically analyzed market trends in developing neighborhoods. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially following my parents' investment strategy, the very approach they had funded with my exploited labor. The difference lay not in the method, but in the ethics and intention behind it. My investments would be built on transparency and conscious choice rather than manipulation and hidden agendas. 6 months after the confrontation with my parents, I identified my first independent investment opportunity: a small duplex in an emerging neighborhood near the university hospital. The property needed substantial renovation, but had strong fundamentals and promising appreciation potential based on announced development projects in the area. The down payment would require most of my accumulated savings, plus a portion of the income I had begun receiving from the lakeside fourplex. It represented significant risk, but calculated risk based on thorough research rather than emotional reaction. When I contacted the mortgage broker recommended by Marion, I was surprised to discover that my existing 30% interest in the fourplex substantially improved my borrowing capacity despite my relatively brief professional history. The partial ownership my parents had reluctantly transferred had become a cornerstone for independent financial expansion. The day I signed the purchase documents for my first wholly owned investment property, I experienced an unexpected emotion. Not triumph over my parents or vindication for past injustices, but simple pride in creating something entirely mine. A foundation built through my own analysis, risk assessment, and strategic decision-making. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Harper. We had spoken only briefly since the confrontation, our conversations stilted and cautious. Her voice sounded different, less entitled, more tentative. "I've been trying to understand what happened with you and Mom and Dad," she began without preamble. "They've explained things in pieces, but I feel like I'm missing important parts of the story." I hesitated, unsure how much to share with a sister who had benefited from the very system that had exploited me. "What specifically are you trying to understand? Why you suddenly demanded property ownership? Why Mom cries sometimes when she thinks no one's watching? Why Dad keeps talking about financial restructuring and adjusted expectations? And, mostly," her voice faltered momentarily, "why I suddenly have to work part-time at the campus bookstore instead of focusing exclusively on my studies like before." The question revealed both her continuing privilege and the beginning of a shift in her understanding. Working part-time during college was normal for most students, but represented a significant downgrade from her previous experience of fully funded education without financial responsibility. "It's a complicated situation with a long history," I replied carefully. "The simplest explanation is that I discovered our parents had been using my financial contributions to build a real estate portfolio while maintaining the fiction that the family was struggling financially." "But we were struggling," Harper protested. "Mom and Dad were always talking about budgets and expenses." They were leveraged in their investments, I clarified. That's different from struggling to meet basic needs. They chose to direct resources toward property acquisition, while simultaneously extracting funds from me through claims of financial necessity. The silence on the line suggested she was processing this information. So, the money I got for tuition and study abroad and everything, that wasn't because they had money for me but not for you? Some of it came directly from my contributions, I confirmed. The rest came from rental income on properties purchased with my diverted college fund and other contributions. Another long pause followed. That seems really unfair to you. The simple acknowledgement of inequity, so obvious yet never previously recognized by any family member, landed with unexpected weight. Not because I needed her validation, but because it suggested the possibility of authentic relationship based on truth rather than manufactured family narrative. It was unfair, I agreed, which is why I negotiated partial ownership of one property as restitution. Is that why Dad made me get a job? Because they have to give you money now? The question revealed her still limited understanding of the situation. They don't give me anything. I receive 30% of the net income from a property purchased primarily with my money. And your job isn't because of me. It's because our parents are adjusting to financial reality without my continued contributions. I could almost hear her reassessing 18 years of family dynamics through this new lens. When she spoke again, her question surprised me. Do you think they love me more than you? The directness cut through pretense to the emotional core of our family's dysfunction. I considered deflecting but chose honesty instead. I think they prioritized your development and opportunities over mine consistently throughout our childhood and young adulthood, I replied carefully. Whether that reflects greater emotional attachment or simply different expectations for our roles in the family is something only they could answer. I never realized. Her voice sounded smaller, younger. I just thought you were naturally more independent, and I needed more support. That narrative benefited everyone except me, I observed without bitterness. You received what you needed without questioning its source. They directed resources according to their preferences without transparency, and I learned to require less and produce more because that was my assigned role. Our conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. The longest, most honest exchange we had ever shared. Harper's perspective remained limited by her experience as the favored child, but I sensed genuine efforts to understand realities that contradicted her comfortable assumptions about our family. Before we ended the call, she asked one final question that suggested potential for growth. How can I do better, as your sister, I mean? Recognize your privileges honestly instead of assuming they were natural or deserved, I suggested. And understand that rebuilding trust requires consistent behavior over time, not just momentary realizations or apologies. Over the following year, my professional advancement accelerated alongside my investment activities. The analytical skills I had honed documenting my family's financial exploitation proved equally valuable in identifying market opportunities and operational inefficiencies within client portfolios. My relationship with my parents settled into formal correctness, quarterly business meetings regarding the shared property, occasional carefully neutral phone conversations, and minimal holiday interactions that maintained appearances without addressing deeper breaches. They never acknowledged the fundamental injustice of their actions, merely the financial consequences of being caught. Harper's evolution proved more encouraging. The requirement to work part-time had introduced her to financial reality in ways that genuinely expanded her perspective. While still benefiting from significantly more parental support than I had ever received, she began developing independence and showing interest in financial literacy beyond immediate consumption. On the anniversary of the confrontation that had transformed our family, I received an unexpected email from her containing a business proposal rather than personal communication. She had identified a potential investment property near her university, a small commercial space with residential units above, and wanted my assessment of its viability as a joint venture. Her analysis was elementary but showed genuine effort to apply principles she had begun learning. More significantly, her proposal acknowledged our different financial positions explicitly. She would contribute sweat equity through management, while I would provide the majority of capital until her ownership percentage could increase through reinvested returns. The transparency of her approach, so different from our parents' manipulative tactics, warranted serious consideration. After thorough due diligence on the property, I agreed to a modified version of her proposal with clearly documented terms and expectations. "Why would you do business with me after everything that happened?" she asked when we met to sign the partnership agreement. "I benefited from the system that exploited you for years. Because you're demonstrating the transparency and ethical approach our parents never did," I replied. "And because building something new based on clear terms seems more productive than remaining defined by past injustice." Our commercial residential property became profitable more quickly than projected, partly due to Harper's surprising aptitude for hands-on management. Her art history degree had developed an aesthetic sensibility that translated effectively to property improvements, while her social connections helped attract stable commercial tenants. As our business relationship developed alongside a cautiously rebuilding personal one, I recognized that her journey toward financial responsibility followed a different path than mine had. While I had learned through necessity and exploitation, she was learning through choice and opportunity. Different roads, but potentially leading to similar destinations of capability and independence. 2 years after discovering the property records that had exposed my parents' financial deception, I hosted a small gathering at my home to celebrate the acquisition of my fourth investment property. Marion attended, along with colleagues who had become friends and mentors from the real estate investment community I had cultivated. Harper arrived last, having driven directly from a property management course she had enrolled in voluntarily. As conversations flowed around successful investments and future opportunities, I observed her engaged participation with a mixture of surprise and appreciation. The entitled girl who had once casually debated which luxury summer program to attend had evolved into a young woman genuinely interested in building rather than merely consuming. "You've created something remarkable," Marion commented privately, as we stood watching the interactions among my guests. "Not just the property portfolio, which is impressive on its own, but this transformation of relationship and purpose." "I'm not sure I can take credit for Harper's evolution," I demurred. "Perhaps not directly," Marion acknowledged, "but by refusing to perpetuate destructive patterns, you created space for new possibilities. Sometimes the most powerful leadership isn't about directing others, but demonstrating alternatives they never considered possible." Her observation crystallized something I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. The property records had indeed changed everything, not just by exposing exploitation, but by creating opportunity for genuinely different choices moving forward. I had transformed financial injury into investment foundation. I had replaced manipulative family dynamics with transparent business relationships. Most importantly, I had demonstrated through consistent action that exploitation wasn't an inevitable feature of family connection or financial collaboration. The portfolio I was building represented more than monetary value or material security. It embodied principles directly counter to those that had shaped my childhood: transparency instead of manipulation, mutual benefit instead of exploitation, choice instead of obligation. These principles were the true assets I had salvaged from the wreckage of family deception, ones that would appreciate in value throughout my lifetime, regardless of market fluctuations. As I looked around at the gathering of people connected through shared values rather than obligatory ties, I recognized that my parents' greatest failure wasn't financial exploitation, but imagination limitation. They had been unable to conceive of success that didn't require someone else's sacrifice, unaware that the most sustainable prosperity emerges from systems where all participants genuinely benefit. I had discovered a different equation, one where my success didn't demand another's exploitation, where collaboration could multiply returns rather than merely redistribute them, where transparency strengthened outcomes rather than threatening them. The property records had revealed painful truth, but the rebuilding process had revealed something more valuable: the possibility of creating prosperity defined by integrity rather than advantage, by mutual growth rather than zero-sum calculation. That possibility represented the most valuable asset in my expanding portfolio, one that would continue generating returns long after any individual property had appreciated to its maximum value. 3 years after the property records revelation, my investment portfolio had grown to include 7 properties, a symmetrical counterpoint to my parents' collection, though mine had been built through transparent means and ethical principles. The monthly passive income had surpassed my salaried earnings at Preston Financial, creating options I had never imagined possible during my years of financial servitude to my family. Marian called me into her office on a crisp autumn morning, closing the door with unusual deliberation. "The executive committee has been reviewing our departmental structure," she began without preamble. "We're creating a new division focused specifically on ethical investment strategies for generational wealth building. I've recommended you to head the division." The offer was unexpected and substantial, a director-level position that would include equity partnership after a 2-year proving period. Under normal circumstances, such advancement would require at least 5 more years on the traditional path. "Why me specifically?" I asked, needing to understand whether the offer reflected genuine recognition or simply Marian's personal advocacy. "3 reasons," she replied with characteristic precision. "First, your investment returns are consistently exceptional, both for clients and in your personal portfolio. Second, your analytical framework integrates ethical considerations without sacrificing performance, increasingly important to our evolving client base. And third," she paused, her expression softening slightly, "you've demonstrated extraordinary resilience and principled thinking under circumstances that would have broken less capable individuals." I considered the opportunity carefully. The key position represented professional validation and substantially increased compensation. Yet it would also require recommitting to corporate structure when my independent investments were approaching the threshold where they could support me completely. "I need to consider how this aligns with my long-term objectives," I responded honestly. "Would you share the detailed expectations and parameters before I decide?" Marian smiled slightly. "That measured response is exactly why we want you in this role. Most would jump at the title and compensation without evaluating the alignment with personal goals. Take a week to review the proposal and consider your path." The comprehensive document she provided outlined a compelling vision for ethical wealth development that resonated deeply with principles I had formulated after extracting myself from my family's exploitative system. Yet something held me back from immediate acceptance. That evening, I scheduled dinner with Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a retired economics professor who had become something of a mentor since we met at an investment symposium the previous year. At 72, Eleanor had built remarkable financial independence. Through methodical investing while maintaining academic integrity throughout her career, a balance I aspired to achieve. "They're offering you exactly what you thought you wanted when you joined the firm," she observed after I explained the situation. "Why the hesitation?" "I'm questioning whether institutional advancement still aligns with my evolved priorities," I admitted. "The passive income from my properties already exceeds my basic needs. Additional properties could provide for any reasonable lifestyle without corporate constraints." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "The question isn't whether you need the position, but whether it serves your deeper purpose. What exactly are you building toward, Olivia? Financial independence is a means, not an end." Her question penetrated beyond practical considerations to essential motivation. What was I building toward? Security and independence had been such dominant drivers after years of exploitation that I hadn't fully articulated what those qualities would enable beyond their inherent value. I want to create systems that prevent what happened to me from happening to others, I realized aloud. Financial education and structures that protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation, disguised as family obligation or cultural expectation. Eleanor's eyes sharpened with interest. That's not just a career direction, it's a mission statement. The real question becomes which platform better serves that mission, corporate leadership or independent development. I spent the week systematically analyzing both paths against my clarified purpose. The corporate role offered immediate infrastructure, established credibility, and access to clients who could benefit from ethical financial strategies. Independent development provided greater autonomy, freedom from shareholder pressures, and the ability to create truly innovative models without institutional constraints. When I met with Marion to discuss my decision, I brought a counter-proposal that reflected this analysis. I'm declining the director position, I began, noting her slight frown, but proposing an alternative arrangement that might serve both our interests. I outlined a consulting relationship wherein I would help establish the new division's framework and train its leadership while maintaining my independent investment activities and developing an educational platform for financial empowerment. The arrangement would give Preston financial access to my expertise without requiring full organizational commitment, while allowing me to leverage their institutional credibility while building my independent vision. Unconventional, Marion commented after considering the proposal, but potentially advantageous for both parties. I'll need board approval for this structure. 3 weeks later, we formalized an arrangement that redefined traditional employment boundaries, a hybrid model that recognized value beyond conventional corporate advancement. The agreement allowed me to maintain control of my schedule and independent ventures while contributing meaningfully to institutional development. With this framework established, I launched the Clarity Foundation, a nonprofit educational initiative focused on financial literacy for individuals from backgrounds where economic exploitation often masqueraded as cultural expectation or family obligation. The foundation offered both practical financial education and specific guidance on recognizing and addressing financial manipulation within family systems. Surprisingly, Harper became one of the foundation's earliest volunteers, having completed her degree and secured a position with an architectural preservation firm that specialized in repurposing historic buildings. I want to help others understand what took me too long to recognize, she explained during training. That family love shouldn't have financial conditions attached, and that unequal treatment isn't justified by personality differences. Her evolution from entitled beneficiary to thoughtful advocate represented perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the property records revelation. While our parents remained entrenched in defensive justification of their actions, Harper had somehow found the courage to examine and reject the preferential system that had benefited her. 6 months after launching the foundation, I received an application for our mentorship program that caught me completely by surprise. 17-year-old Mia Chen, no relation, described family circumstances eerily parallel to my own. Working since age 15 to contribute to family expenses, while her brother received fully funded educational opportunities and material support without reciprocal expectations. During our interview, Mia's carefully maintained composure occasionally revealed glimpses of the same suppressed anger and confusion I had experienced at her age. She had discovered our foundation through an internet search for parents using my money unfairly, finding in our materials the validation and terminology to understand her situation. I know something's wrong with how they treat us differently, she explained. But whenever I question it, they say I'm being ungrateful for everything they've sacrificed for me. Am I crazy for thinking it's not normal to give them half my paycheck, while my brother gets a new gaming setup? You're not crazy, I assured her. You're recognizing a pattern of financial manipulation that's unfortunately common but rarely discussed openly. As our mentorship program helped Mia develop both practical financial skills and emotional boundaries with her family, I recognized how profoundly different her trajectory might be from mine, where I had spent years submitting to exploitation. Before finding clarity and restitution, she was gaining awareness and tools at 17, potentially saving a decade of financial servitude and emotional manipulation. The foundation expanded rapidly, identifying similar patterns across diverse cultural backgrounds and socioeconomic levels. Financial exploitation within families proved remarkably consistent in structure while varying in specific manifestations. We developed specialized programs for particular demographic groups, addressing cultural nuances that often complicated recognition and resolution of these patterns. By its second anniversary, the Clarity Foundation had served over 3,000 individuals through direct programming and reached tens of thousands more through online resources. While maintaining my consulting relationship with Preston Financial and continuing to develop my investment portfolio, I increasingly focused on expanding the foundation's reach and effectiveness. On a Thursday afternoon, as I was reviewing curriculum, materials for our high school financial literacy program, my assistant interrupted with unusual urgency. "Your father is here," she announced, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected visitor. "He doesn't have an appointment but insists it's important family business." I hadn't seen my father in nearly 8 months, our communication limited to quarterly property management updates conducted primarily through email. His unannounced appearance at my foundation offices represented a significant departure from our established boundaries. "You can send him in," I decided after brief consideration. Whatever had prompted this unusual initiative, addressing it directly seemed preferable to speculation. My father entered my office with the measured confidence that had once intimidated me, but now registered simply as a practiced persona. However, something in his bearing suggested uncharacteristic uncertainty beneath the composed exterior. "This is impressive," he commented, glancing around at the modern space decorated with student artwork from our community programs. "Very professional operation." "Thank you," I replied neutrally. "What brings you here today?" He placed a folder on my desk with deliberate care. "Your mother and I have been reassessing our estate planning. We've decided to make some adjustments that I wanted to discuss with you personally." I regarded the folder without reaching for it. "I'm not sure why estate planning would require an unscheduled visit. We have established channels for necessary communication." "This is different," he insisted, an unfamiliar note in his voice, suggesting something beyond our usual business interactions. "It's about making certain things right while we still can." Curiosity overcame caution, and I opened the folder to find legal documents transferring additional property interests to both Harper and me, specifically 25% ownership in each of their remaining 6 properties, divided equally between us. "Why now?" I asked, genuinely puzzled by this unexpected redistribution after years of resistance to acknowledging the fundamental injustice of their actions. My father's carefully maintained composure showed subtle cracks as he responded. "Your mother has been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. It's treatable, and progression may be slow, but it's forced us to confront certain realities about time and consequences." The news landed with complex impact. Concern for my mother's health intermingled with wariness about emotional manipulation disguised as reconciliation. "I'm sorry to hear about Mom's diagnosis," I said sincerely. "But that doesn't explain this significant financial restructuring after years of defending your previous arrangements." He looked momentarily disoriented by my direct approach, perhaps expecting gratitude or immediate reconciliation. When he spoke again, his voice carried an unfamiliar quality, something approaching genuine reflection rather than strategic positioning. "Your foundation's website has a section about parents recognizing and addressing financial inequity between children," he said unexpectedly. "Your mother found it during an internet search about family reconciliation. We've read every article, watched all the webinars." The revelation that my parents had been consuming our educational content without my knowledge was genuinely surprising. The foundation made no secret of my identity or personal experience, but I had never imagined my parents engaging with material that directly challenged their actions and choices. The section on legacy planning was particularly clarifying. My father continued when I remained silent. The idea that what we leave behind isn't just financial assets, but the story of what we truly valued through our actions. I studied him carefully, searching for signs of the manipulative tactics I had learned to recognize in our interactions. What I saw instead was something I had never witnessed from him: genuine discomfort with his own actions. Your mother and... I don't expect forgiveness or even renewed relationship, he added, but we wanted to take concrete steps toward acknowledging the imbalance in how we treated you and Harper. This property transfer is legally binding, regardless of whether you choose to engage with us moving forward. The documents appeared legitimate upon initial review, though I would have them thoroughly examined by independent counsel before accepting their validity. More significant than the financial implications was the unprecedented acknowledgement, however indirect, that their treatment had been fundamentally unjust rather than merely pragmatic. I appreciate the gesture, I said carefully. I'll have my attorney review these documents, and we can proceed through proper legal channels to formalize any transfers. He nodded, accepting the business-like response rather than pushing for emotional reconnection. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated, at the door. The work you're doing here, he gestured to encompass the foundation offices. It's important. Helping young people understand financial relationships within families. I wish something like this had existed when we were making our early decisions as parents. The comment wasn't quite an apology, but it represented more genuine reflection than I had ever witnessed from him. I acknowledged it with a simple nod, understanding that legacy concerns rather than genuine remorse likely motivated this belated adjustment. Nevertheless, it represented movement in a direction I had long since stopped expecting. After he left, I sat quietly processing the unexpected development. The additional property interests would substantially increase my assets and passive income, but their significance lay more in the acknowledgement they represented than their financial value. After years of defending their choices as appropriate and justifiable, my parents had taken concrete steps toward recognizing the inequity they had created and perpetuated. This acknowledgement couldn't erase years of exploitation or heal the emotional damage of being valued primarily as a resource rather than a daughter. But it suggested possibilities I had dismissed as unrealistic, that people deeply entrenched in patterns of manipulation and self-justification might still be capable of meaningful, if limited, change when confronted with undeniable truth. The property records that had initially changed everything by exposing deception were now changing something else, the narrative my parents would leave behind. Not through complete transformation or perfect justice, but through incremental movement toward truth and proportional restitution. I turned back to the foundation curriculum I had been reviewing before the interruption, materials designed to help young people recognize and address financial exploitation within family systems. The work felt more important than ever, not because such patterns could always be prevented or perfectly resolved, but because awareness itself created possibilities for different choices and clearer boundaries. The future I was building extended beyond personal financial security or professional recognition to something more fundamental, creating pathways for others to achieve with clarity and support what I had accomplished through painful discovery and isolation. This purpose had emerged directly from exploitation, transformed into education, injury converted to insight that could benefit others facing similar circumstances. In this transformation lay perhaps the most motivational aspect of my journey, the recognition that our most painful experiences, when properly processed and purposefully directed, can become our most powerful contributions to others. The property records had changed everything, not just by revealing truth about my past, but by illuminating possibilities for a future where exploitation patterns could be recognized, named, and disrupted before claiming decades of someone else's potential. 5 years after discovering the property records that had exposed my family's financial exploitation, I stood at the podium of a regional economic development conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address on ethical wealth, building across generations. The audience of 400 included financial advisors, community leaders, educators, and individuals seeking to transform their relationship with money and family dynamics. As I adjusted the microphone, I caught sight of an unexpected face. In the third row, Harper, who had mentioned nothing about attending when we'd spoken earlier that week. She gave me a subtle thumbs up, her presence a reminder of how profoundly relationships could evolve when built on transparent foundations. Financial literacy is typically discussed in terms of practical skills, I began. Understanding compound, interest, managing debt, or building investment portfolios. These skills are essential, but they address only part of a more complex picture. Today, I want to examine the intersection of family systems, cultural expectations, and financial boundaries, where our most profound financial patterns are established long before we make our first independent financial decision. The room grew attentive as I shared research conducted through the Clarity Foundation, highlighting patterns of financial exploitation disguised as family obligation across diverse demographic groups. Without mentioning my personal experience directly, I outlined the warning signs of unequal financial expectations between family members and the long-term consequences for both exploited individuals and family systems. The most insidious aspect of financial exploitation within families is how effectively it masquerades as virtue. I continued. Contributing to family needs becomes framed as responsibility, loyalty, or cultural expectation. Questioning unequal treatment becomes recast as selfishness or ingratitude. This framing creates psychological barriers to establishing appropriate boundaries long before financial ones. As the presentation moved from problem identification to solution frameworks, I introduced the clarity principles, 7 fundamental concepts our foundation had developed to guide individuals in establishing healthy financial relationships within family systems. Each principle addressed different aspects of financial autonomy while acknowledging legitimate family interdependence. Financial independence isn't about isolation from family obligations, I emphasized. It's about ensuring those obligations are transparent, equitable, and consensual, rather than manipulated or coerced. The goal isn't rejection of family responsibility, but transformation of how those responsibilities are negotiated and distributed. Following the presentation, attendees engaged in workshop sessions applying these principles to specific scenarios. I circulated among the groups, observing the profound revelations occurring as participants recognized patterns in their own family financial dynamics that had previously seemed normal or inevitable. During the networking reception afterward, Harper approached, professional in her tailored blazer but with the familiar mischievous glint in her eye that had emerged as she developed her authentic personality beyond our parents' expectations. "Powerful presentation," she said, "especially considering you never once used the phrase 'like my manipulative parents did to me,' despite having every right to." I smiled at her characteristically direct assessment. The principles are more important than my personal experience, though that experience certainly informed their development. "Speaking of our parents," she continued, her expression growing more serious, "Mom asked me to give you this, said it was important, but understood. If you didn't want direct contact." She handed me a sealed envelope, thick, suggesting multiple pages enclosed. I accepted it without immediate comment, tucking it into my portfolio for later examination. "Any idea what it contains?" I asked. Harper shook her head. "She's been different since the diagnosis, more reflective, actually listening instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. Dad, too, surprisingly. Whatever epiphany they're having, it seems genuine, if belated. The remainder of the conference passed in productive conversations and new professional connections. The Clarity Foundation's work was gaining significant recognition within financial and educational communities, with implementation of our curriculum expanding into school districts across 3 states. That evening in my hotel room, I finally opened the envelope from my mother. Inside, I found a handwritten letter, unusual in itself, as our limited communication in recent years had been primarily electronic and focused on property management logistics. "Dear Olivia," it began, the handwriting more tremulous than I remembered, perhaps an effect of her condition. "I've started this letter dozens of times over the past months, searching for words that might adequately address the harm we caused you through years of unequal treatment and financial exploitation. I've realized no such perfect words exist. No expression of remorse can fully mitigate actions sustained over decades. Your father and I have been working with a family therapist specializing in financial trauma and inequality between siblings. This wasn't prompted by hope of reconciliation, which we recognize may never be possible, but by genuine desire to understand how we justified such profoundly unequal treatment of our daughters. The painful truth we've confronted is that we never truly saw you as an independent person with equal value and potential. From early childhood, we categorized you and Harper into rigid roles. You as the responsible provider, and Harper as the special talent requiring investment. These weren't conscious decisions initially, but unconscious patterns that became increasingly deliberate as they served our financial goals. The property transfer your father discussed with you represents acknowledgement of financial damage, but cannot address the deeper harm of treating a child as a resource rather than a person. No financial restitution can return the opportunities, experiences, and sense of unconditional belonging that should have been your birthright. I don't ask for forgiveness or renewed relationship. Those must be earned through sustained change, not requested through emotional appeals. I write simply to provide what I should have offered years ago: acknowledgement that our treatment was fundamentally unjust, not because of financial mechanics, but because it denied your essential equality and worth as our daughter. The foundation you've built helps others recognize patterns we perpetuated. This represents transformation of injury into protection for others, perhaps the most profound response possible to systemic harm. Whatever relationship does or doesn't exist between us moving forward, please know I recognize the extraordinary strength this transformation required. With respect and regret, Diane Reed. Enclosed with the letter was a leather-bound journal, my mother's handwriting filling its pages with dated entries spanning my childhood through early adulthood. Skimming the contents revealed something unexpected: contemporaneous documentation of their financial decisions regarding Harper and me, including explicit acknowledgement of using my earnings for investment properties while presenting these extractions as necessary family contributions. The journal represented something beyond the property transfers or even the letter's acknowledgments. Evidence that my parents had been consciously aware of the inequality they were creating, rather than simply following unconscious patterns or responding to financial necessity. The entries documented deliberate choices made with full understanding of their disparate impact. This confirmation of intentionality might have reignited anger earlier in my journey. Now, it primarily provided validation of perceptions I had questioned for years before the property records confirmed them. The journal offered nothing I needed, for financial or legal purposes, but provided something perhaps more valuable: external confirmation that my experience had been accurately perceived rather than distorted by sensitivity or misunderstanding. I closed the journal, considering its significance in my ongoing journey. My mother's letter suggested genuine reflection, but transformation required more than acknowledgement. It demanded sustained behavioral change and appropriate restitution. The property transfers represented meaningful steps in that direction. but relationship healing would require consistent demonstration of different values over time. The following morning, I delivered the closing address of the conference, focusing on the transformative potential of financial clarity across generations. When we establish transparent financial boundaries within families, I explained, we create possibility for authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. This transformation doesn't occur through single conversations or momentary realizations, but through consistent application of clear principles over time. As the conference concluded, several participants approached with stories mirroring aspects of my journey. Individuals who had recognized patterns of financial manipulation within their families and begun establishing boundaries that honored both legitimate interdependence and personal autonomy. Mia Chen, now 22 and serving as a program coordinator for the Clarity Foundation after completing her business degree, joined me as we prepared to depart. 5 participants requested immediate consultation with our legal team, she reported, and 23 signed up for the intensive workshop next month. This conference reached people who truly needed these concepts. Her efficient professionalism reflected her remarkable evolution from the uncertain 17-year-old who had first sought our guidance. Through scholarship programs we had established and mentorship relationships with experienced financial professionals, Mia had developed capabilities that positioned her for genuine financial independence while maintaining appropriate family connections on her own terms. The ripple effects matter most, I responded. Each person who establishes healthy financial boundaries potentially impacts dozens of others through changed expectations and demonstrated alternatives. On the flight home, I reflected on the comprehensive transformation the property records revelation had initiated, not just in my financial position or family relationships, but in my fundamental purpose. The exploitation that might have remained. A private injury had been transformed into educational frameworks benefiting thousands. The patterns that could have been dismissed as individual family dysfunction had been recognized as systemic issues requiring structural solutions. Upon returning to my office, I found an unexpected proposal waiting from the State Education Department. They were seeking to implement the Clarity Foundation's financial literacy curriculum across all public high schools, potentially reaching over 300,000 students annually. The proposal included substantial funding for teacher training and program evaluation, representing mainstream recognition of work that had initially seemed niche or specialized. As I reviewed the detailed implementation plan, I recognized how profoundly different these students' experiences might be from my own adolescence. While I had worked unknowingly to fund my parents' investment properties under the guise of family obligation, these young people would learn to recognize exploitation patterns, establish appropriate boundaries, and build financial independence, without sacrificing legitimate family connections. This potential for generational transformation transcended personal vindication or individual success. The financial exploitation I had experienced, once transformed into educational curriculum and practical resources, could help break cycles of manipulation that had persisted across generations in countless families. The property records had changed everything by revealing truth, but the subsequent journey had revealed something more profound: the possibility of transforming personal injury into structural change, of using individual experience to illuminate systemic patterns and develop practical solutions applicable beyond any single family's dysfunction. As I prepared for a meeting with the Education Department representatives, I reflected on the journal my mother had shared. Its documentation of deliberate exploitation provided final confirmation of patterns I had long since verified through property records and financial analysis. Yet its significance lay not in revealing new information, but in demonstrating that even those deeply entrenched in justifying exploitative patterns could eventually acknowledge their harm, not through external pressure alone, but through confrontation with documented reality of their actions. This possibility for acknowledgement, however belated or partial, suggested capacity for change that extended beyond my particular family situation to broader patterns of financial exploitation. If my parents could eventually recognize the fundamental injustice of their actions after decades of self-justification, perhaps similar recognition could occur in other contexts where financial exploitation had been normalized under various cultural or family pretexts. The truly motivational aspect of this journey wasn't financial success or even professional recognition, but the possibility that illuminating harmful patterns could create space for different choices, that bringing exploitation into clear view could disrupt its continuation not just in individual families but across generations and communities. The property records had changed everything by providing incontrovertible evidence of exploitation that could not be dismissed as misperception or misunderstanding. But the enduring transformation lay in what had been built with that truth. Educational frameworks, support systems, and transparent models that created genuine alternatives to exploitation, disguised as family obligation. This transformative potential represented the most meaningful legacy of my journey. Not the properties acquired or professional position achieved, but the possibility that others might establish healthier financial relationships without first experiencing decades of manipulation that required painful extraction and rebuilding. As I welcomed the Education Department representatives into our Foundation's conference room, I recognized that each expansion of our programs represented not just organizational growth, but multiplication of potential impact. Each student reached, potentially representing a family system where exploitation patterns might be interrupted before claiming decades of someone's financial and emotional development. In this possibility for preemptive transformation lay perhaps the most profound motivation of all: the recognition that exposing harmful patterns could create space for fundamentally different futures, not just for individuals directly affected, but for entire systems built on more transparent and equitable foundations. The statewide implementation of the Clarity Foundation's financial literacy curriculum transformed our organization virtually overnight. What had begun as a targeted initiative born from personal experience now required infrastructure, standardized training protocols, and evaluation metrics to function effectively at scale. The transition from grassroots movement to institutional program brought both expanded influence and unforeseen challenges. On a brisk Tuesday morning, I convened our newly expanded leadership team in the Foundation's conference room, a diverse group including educators, financial experts, family systems therapists, and program graduates who had experienced financial exploitation firsthand. This expansion represents opportunity and responsibility in equal measure, I began, surveying the committed professionals who had joined our mission. 300,000 students annually will encounter these concepts. For many, it will be their first exposure to the idea that family financial relationships should be transparent and equitable rather than manipulative or exploitative. Dr. Leah Winters, our Curriculum Development Director with 20 years of experience in educational psychology, leaned forward with characteristic directness. The Education Department's Review Committee has expressed concerns about potential cultural sensitivity issues. They worry our emphasis on individual financial boundaries might conflict with collectivist values in certain communities. This critique reflected a recurring challenge in our work: the delicate balance between respecting genuine cultural differences in family financial interdependence while identifying exploitation patterns that often hid behind cultural justifications. A legitimate concern that requires thoughtful navigation, I acknowledged. We're not promoting Western individualism as the only valid approach to family finances. We're distinguishing between consensual interdependence and coercive extraction, disguised as cultural tradition. Miguel Rodriguez, who had joined our team after experiencing financial manipulation within his multi-generational household, offered valuable perspective. In my family, financial support across generations was expected and valued. The problem wasn't interdependence itself, but the unequal application of these expectations between siblings and the lack of transparency about how contributions were used. Exactly, I agreed. Our curriculum needs to clearly distinguish between legitimate cultural practices involving family financial cooperation and exploitation patterns that selectively target certain family members while exempting others. Over the following weeks, we collaborated with cultural consultants, religious leaders, and community representatives to refine our materials, ensuring they addressed exploitation without undermining genuine cultural values around family interdependence. This process strengthened rather than diluted our core message by acknowledging nuance while maintaining clear boundaries around manipulative practices. The pilot implementation in 50 schools revealed encouraging results. Students demonstrated significantly improved ability to identify financial manipulation tactics, articulate appropriate boundaries, and distinguish between legitimate family needs and exploitative demands. Most importantly, they developed practical communication strategies for addressing problematic patterns without rejecting family connection entirely. What surprised us were the ripple effects beyond the students themselves. Teachers reported parents contacting them after reviewing homework assignments, sometimes emotional upon recognizing patterns in their own family histories. School counselors noted increased requests for guidance from students recognizing exploitation in their current family situations. Community organizations began requesting workshops for adult members who had encountered these concepts through their children's curriculum. One such workshop in a predominantly immigrant neighborhood attracted over 70 adults ranging from early 20s to senior citizens. As I observed from the back of the room, our facilitator carefully navigated complex discussions about distinguishing cultural financial practices from exploitation. "My parents sacrificed everything to bring us to this country," one young woman shared, her voice reflecting both gratitude and emerging awareness. "I've always sent money home without question because of this sacrifice, but recently I've realized my brothers aren't expected to contribute anything despite higher incomes." When I mentioned this disparity, I was immediately accused of becoming too American and forgetting my culture. An older woman nodded with pained recognition. "In our tradition, daughters are expected to care for parents. This is honorable and important. But there is difference between sharing from abundance with choice and taking essential needs from one child while another lives in luxury. This is not culture. This is unfairness wearing culture's clothing." These community conversations revealed that our work wasn't about rejecting cultural values around family interdependence, but about bringing transparency, equity, and consent to how these values were implemented. The distinction resonated across diverse communities once framed in terms of consistent application, rather than individualistic rejection of family responsibility. As the statewide implementation progressed, we established a research division to track longer-term impacts of the curriculum. Initial findings suggested that students exposed to these concepts not only established healthier financial boundaries, but demonstrated greater willingness to participate in legitimate family support when based on transparent expectations and equitable application. 6 months into the implementation, I received an unexpected invitation to meet with Federal Reserve officials interested in our curriculum as a potential component of national financial literacy standards. The meeting would involve presenting our approach to a committee examining intergenerational financial dynamics and their impact on economic mobility. "This represents potential for national impact," Marion observed when I shared the invitation. Now semi-retired but still serving as my occasional advisor, she maintained sharp strategic insight. But federal adoption would require navigating significant political sensitivities around family structure and cultural practices. "The core principles transcend political positioning," I replied. "Exploitation disguised as family obligation damages economic development regardless of cultural context or political affiliation. The question is whether we can maintain the curriculum's integrity while making it accessible across diverse perspectives." The preparation for this presentation prompted deeper examination of our underlying philosophy. Beyond the practical aspects of recognizing and addressing financial exploitation, Our work contained more fundamental principles about human dignity and equitable relationship. The idea that genuine family connection couldn't coexist with systematic exploitation of certain members for others' benefit. As I refined the presentation materials, I received an unexpected message from Harper. "Dad's been hospitalized. Cardiac event. Stable but serious. Thought you should know." The notification arrived without emotional manipulation or expectation, simply information I might want when making decisions about my own boundaries and choices. This straightforward communication reflected how profoundly our relationship had evolved from the manipulative dynamics that had characterized our family. After consideration, I decided to visit briefly without disrupting the boundaries I had established. The hospital room contained the expected medical equipment, but the atmosphere felt unfamiliar. My father diminished physically, my mother watchful but restrained in her greeting. Neither displayed the emotional leverage attempts that would have been automatic in earlier years. "Thank you for coming," my father said simply, his voice weaker but the characteristic directness intact. Not expected or required, but appreciated. The acknowledgement of my autonomy, so different from the obligation-based dynamics of the past, suggested genuine evolution in his understanding rather than merely strategic adaptation to change circumstances. Our conversation remained brief and primarily focused on his medical situation rather than emotional reconciliation or relationship renegotiation. As I prepared to leave, he mentioned something unexpected. "I've been following the Foundation's expansion," he said, "the statewide curriculum implementation. It's significant work with meaningful impact." The comment contained no attempt to claim credit, establish connection, or extract emotional response, simply acknowledgement of professional accomplishment separated from our personal history. This distinction between recognizing achievement and using it to manipulate relationship represented genuine progress in our interaction patterns. The following week, I presented our curriculum approach to the Federal Reserve Committee, a distinguished group of economists, educators, and financial policy specialists focused on improving financial resilience across demographic groups. The SAO presentation emphasized practical application rather than theory, showing specifically how exploitation patterns created long-term economic vulnerability that affected not just individuals but broader economic systems. The financial exploitation we address isn't limited to dramatic cases of elder abuse or obvious fraud, I explained. More commonly, it operates through normalized family patterns that systematically extract resources from certain members while exempting others, justified through appeals to tradition, obligation, or necessity, rather than transparent agreement. The committee's questions reflected professional skepticism appropriately applied, challenging assumptions, examining methodology, and probing for unintended consequences. Rather than defensive resistance, I welcomed this rigorous examination as strengthening the work through diverse perspective and stress testing core concepts. Dr. Elaine Chen, the committee chair with extensive experience in behavioral economics, offered particularly insightful critique. "Your approach identifies exploitation patterns effectively, but I'm concerned about potential overcorrection toward individualism that might undermine legitimate family interdependence, particularly in communities where resource pooling represents survival strategy rather than exploitation." A valid concern requiring continuous calibration, I acknowledged. Our curriculum distinguishes exploitative patterns through 3 key indicators: selective application to certain family members but not others, absence of transparent disclosure about how contributions are used, and denial of proportional decision-making influence to contributing members. These markers help identify exploitation while respecting consensual interdependence. The committee's response indicated genuine engagement with the curriculum's potential rather than polite professional interest. 2 members requested permission to implement pilot programs in their affiliated institutions, while others suggested collaborative research initiatives examining connections between family financial patterns and broader economic resilience. Following this presentation, requests for the Foundation's training and materials expanded beyond educational institutions to include financial service providers, social service agencies, and religious organizations whose leaders had recognized these patterns within their communities. This diverse adoption demonstrated that addressing financial exploitation within families resonated across ideological and cultural boundaries, once framed in terms of transparency and consistent application rather than rejection of interdependence. The expansion occurred as my personal investment portfolio crossed a significant threshold, reaching financial independence that would support my needs indefinitely without requiring additional active income. This milestone represented not just security against future exploitation, but freedom to direct my efforts based on impact potential rather than compensation necessity. To commemorate this achievement and establish a sustainable model for the Foundation's future, I established an endowment fund with a significant portion of my investment income. The structure ensured the Foundation could maintain independence from funding sources that might compromise its mission, while providing necessary resources for continued growth and adaptation. During the endowment announcement, I shared perspective on the journey that had led to this point. Financial independence isn't valuable merely for the material security it provides, but for the freedom it creates to define relationship on mutual terms rather than dependency. The exploitation I experienced wasn't damaging primarily because of dollars diverted, but because it established relationship patterns based on extraction rather than connection. This understanding, that financial patterns reflected and reinforced deeper relationship dynamics, had become the philosophical core of our curriculum. Beyond teaching practical recognition of exploitation tactics, we were providing framework for understanding how financial relationships embodied and enacted underlying values about human worth and dignity. As the Foundation's work expanded nationally, I received an invitation to address a congressional committee examining financial literacy education standards. The preparation for this testimony prompted reflection on how far the work had evolved, from its origins in personal experience, transforming from individual healing journey to structural initiative with potential to reshape how financial relationships functioned across generations. The property records that had initially revealed my parents' exploitation had catalyzed not just personal liberation, but institutional change that might prevent similar experiences for countless others. This expansion of impact represented the most meaningful outcome possible from painful experience, transformation of individual injury into systemic protection. At the Foundation's 5th anniversary celebration, Mia Chen, now our Director of Community Programs, summarized this transformation eloquently. Financial exploitation persists because it remains unnamed, normalized, and hidden behind cultural or family justifications. By creating language, recognition tools, and practical alternatives, we're not just helping individuals establish boundaries, we're changing the fundamental assumptions that allow exploitation to function as acceptable family dynamic. Her observation captured the essence of our work's motivational power. The recognition that patterns once experienced as isolated personal injury could be transformed into collective protection through naming, analysis, and alternative creation. This transformative potential represented genuine alchemy, converting exploitation's leaden weight into the gold of structural change. 7 years after discovering the property records that had exposed my family's financial manipulation, I received a call from an unfamiliar number while reviewing grant applications in my office. The voice on the other end belonged to Gerald Thornton, a lawyer I didn't recognize. "Ms. Reed, I'm calling regarding your grandmother, Eleanor Reed. I regret to inform you that she passed away yesterday evening." The news landed with unexpected impact. My paternal grandmother had been a peripheral figure in my childhood, living in another state and visiting only occasionally. Our relationship had consisted primarily of birthday cards containing crisp, $20 bills and brief awkward interactions during holiday gatherings. I hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. "I'm sorry to hear that," I responded. genuinely saddened by her passing, though confused by the personal notification. But I'm not sure why you're contacting me directly. Wouldn't my father be handling arrangements? That's why I'm calling, the lawyer explained. Your grandmother amended her will 3 years ago, naming you as her primary beneficiary and executor of her estate. Your father is aware of this designation, but suggested you might be surprised by the appointment. Surprised was an understatement. I had no knowledge of any particular connection or relationship with my grandmother that would explain this unexpected designation. We had exchanged perhaps a dozen conversations throughout my entire life. There must be some mistake, I suggested. We barely knew each other. There's no mistake, Ms. Reed. Mrs. Eleanor Reed was quite specific and of sound mind when making these arrangements. She left explanatory letters for all concerned parties. I've already sent yours via courier. You should receive it tomorrow. In the meantime, would you be available to meet regarding initial estate matters next week? After arranging the meeting and ending the call, I sat quietly processing this development. My immediate assumption was that the estate would be modest. Perhaps some personal effects and a small savings account. My grandmother had lived simply in the same modest house for decades, working as a high school librarian until retirement. I had never heard any suggestion of significant family wealth on that side. The courier package arrived the following morning. A large envelope containing legal documents requiring my signature and a sealed personal letter with my name written in shaky but elegant cursive. Setting aside the formal paperwork, I opened the letter with growing curiosity. My dear Olivia, it began, the handwriting suggesting someone who had learned penmanship in a different era. If you're reading this, I've finally departed this world, hopefully with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. Attributes I've always valued and observed in you from afar. You're undoubtedly surprised by my decision to name you as executor and primary beneficiary, given our limited direct interaction. Throughout your life, this deserves explanation. While we rarely spoke, I've followed your journey with attention and growing admiration. Your father's occasional mentions of your activities, supplemented by my own research into your foundation's work, revealed a young woman of exceptional integrity and purpose. What you couldn't have known is that I recognized the pattern of your treatment within your family because I had seen it before, in how my husband treated your father compared to his brother. The favoritism, the unequal expectations, the extraction of resources from one child to benefit another. It's a family pattern that has repeated across generations, though manifesting differently each time. When your grandfather died, he left his estate primarily to your uncle Richard, continuing this pattern of favoritism. However, my own assets, inherited from my family and supplemented through decades of careful investment, remained under my control. I've watched with interest how you transformed personal injury into public benefit through your foundation's work, addressing the very patterns that affected your childhood. My estate includes several matters that may surprise you. First, the modest house where I've lived is actually one of 12 investment properties I acquired throughout my teaching career. Living simply allowed me to invest consistently, and these properties have appreciated significantly over 5 decades. Second, my seemingly modest librarian's salary was supplemented by significant family assets I inherited, but kept private, partially to avoid interference from family members who demonstrated poor financial judgment, and partially from habit. Formed during an era when women's financial independence was uncommon and often undermined. Finally, I've maintained a diverse investment portfolio focused on educational technology companies, renewable energy development, and affordable housing. Initiatives, areas aligned with my values while generating substantial returns. I've chosen you as executor and primary inheritor not out of sentiment or biological obligation, but because you've demonstrated the character, judgment, and purpose necessary to utilize these resources meaningfully. Where your father and uncle saw assets only as means for personal comfort or status, you've shown capacity to envision resources as tools for structural change. This inheritance carries no obligations or conditions. Use it as you determine appropriate, whether for personal security, foundation expansion, or entirely different purposes. My only request is that you consider how these resources might help disrupt harmful patterns, financial, familial, or social, that perpetuate inequality and exploitation. With respect and confidence, Eleanor Reed. The letter left me momentarily speechless. Not just the unexpected inheritance, but the revelation that my grandmother had been quietly observing my journey and making connections to generational patterns I had only recently begun to understand. She had recognized the exploitation in my childhood not through direct disclosure, but through pattern recognition from her own family history. The meeting with Gerald Thornton the following week revealed the full scope of what Eleanor had termed her modest assets. 12 fully paid investment properties in appreciating markets, a diversified portfolio valued at approximately $8.6 million, art and antiquities conservatively appraised at $2 million, and liquid assets exceeding $3 million. Your grandmother lived quite modestly compared to her actual resources, Gerald explained as I reviewed the documentation with stunned attention. She believed conspicuous consumption attracted interference and undermined independence. However, she was quite strategic in her investment approach, focusing on assets that aligned with her values while generating significant returns. Beyond the financial aspects, Eleanor had left extensive journals documenting her observations of family patterns across 3 generations. These records revealed her as a keen observer of human behavior, who had recognized and analyzed the cyclical nature of favoritism and exploitation within the family system long before I had experienced it directly. She mentioned specific instructions regarding notification of other family members, Gerald continued. While you're named as primary beneficiary receiving approximately 70% of the estate, there are smaller allocations to various relatives, including your father and sister. Mrs. Reed requested these individuals be notified only after you've had time to review the complete estate and understand your role as executor. The responsibility was significant but not overwhelming given my financial background and experience. What required deeper processing was the philosophical implication of this unexpected inheritance. For years, I had built my foundation and personal narrative around transforming exploitation into education, converting injury into protection for others. Now I faced the question of how to integrate substantial unearned resources into that narrative without undermining its authenticity or purpose. After ensuring all legal requirements were properly addressed, I took 2 weeks of limited professional engagement to thoroughly review Eleanor's journals and financial records. The journals revealed a remarkable woman who had maintained careful observation of family dynamics while developing independent financial expertise during an era when women were actively discouraged from such pursuits. More striking were the parallels she had noted between how my grandfather had treated my father, as the responsible son expected to contribute, versus my Uncle Richard, as the special son deserving investment, and how my parents had later replicated this pattern with Harper and me. These observations suggested the exploitation I had experienced wasn't simply individual parental failure, but manifestation of intergenerational patterns. This perspective expanded my understanding of the Foundation's work beyond individual family dysfunction to addressing inherited relational templates that perpetuated exploitation across generations without conscious awareness. Eleanor's journals provided historical context for patterns I had addressed primarily in contemporary manifestations. 3 weeks after learning of the inheritance, I convened a special meeting of the Clarity Foundation's board to discuss potential implications for our work. The board included financial experts, family systems therapists, education specialists, and individuals with personal experience of financial exploitation within families. Diverse perspectives necessary for navigating this unexpected development. This inheritance creates both opportunity and challenge for our mission, I acknowledged. The financial resources could significantly expand our programmatic impact, However, we must consider how to integrate substantial unearned assets into work specifically addressing exploitation of earned contributions. Dr. Imani Washington, our research director with background in intergenerational trauma patterns, offered valuable perspective. Your grandmother's journals documenting pattern recognition across generations actually strengthen our conceptual framework. They demonstrate that exploitative financial relationships aren't just individual pathology, but transmitted family systems that can be identified, interrupted, and transformed. Additionally, noted Roberto Mendez, our financial education coordinator, this inheritance represents a different model of intergenerational wealth transfer, one based on recognition of shared values and demonstrated purpose, rather than mere biological relationship or favoritism. That model itself has educational value for our curriculum. These insights helped reshape my thinking about the inheritance from potential contradiction of our work to expansion of its scope and impact. Eleanor's decision to transfer resources, based on observed purpose alignment rather than traditional family hierarchy, demonstrated alternative approaches to intergenerational financial relationships, models we could incorporate into our educational frameworks. After thorough consideration and consultation with key advisors, I developed a three-part approach to integrating the inheritance with both personal values and organizational mission. First, I established a separate endowment for the Clarity Foundation with approximately 40% of the inherited assets, ensuring long-term sustainability while maintaining independence from external funding priorities. This structure would allow expansion of educational programs nationally while supporting research initiatives examining intergenerational financial patterns across diverse cultural contexts. Second, I allocated 30% toward establishing a new initiative specifically addressing intergenerational wealth transfer ethics, developing frameworks, educational materials, and consultation services helping families create financial transitions. Based on transparent values rather than unconscious patterns or manipulative dynamics, this program would draw directly from Eleanor's journals and approach as case study in purposeful inheritance planning. Third, I designated the remaining 30% for personal financial security and independent investment activities, respecting Eleanor's explicit statement that the inheritance carried no obligation toward specific utilization, while maintaining alignment with values of ethical resource deployment. Ironically, the same week I finalized these arrangements, I received notification that my father had been hospitalized again, this time with more serious cardiac complications requiring surgical intervention. The notification came through Harper, maintaining the boundary-respecting communication pattern we had established in recent years. After consideration, I arranged a brief hospital visit, maintaining appropriate boundaries while acknowledging serious medical circumstances. The man I encountered appeared physically diminished compared to the imposing figure who had dominated my childhood financial reality. More surprising was his apparent lack of resentment regarding Eleanor's inheritance decision. Mother always maintained her independence, he observed, his voice weaker but the characteristic analytical tone intact. She made systematic observations and decisions based on pattern recognition. Very much like you, actually. The comparison startled me. I had never considered potential similarities between my analytical approach and traits inherited from this branch of the family. Our financial values diverged dramatically, but perhaps methodological parallels existed that I had overlooked while focusing on ethical differences. She recognized something in your approach that resonated with her own, he continued. Not sentiment or favoritism, but alignment of purpose and method. There's certain consistency in her choice, despite its unconventional nature. This unexpected acknowledgement, neither requesting reconsideration of the inheritance distribution nor attempting emotional manipulation, suggested genuine recognition of Eleanor's autonomous decision-making rather than entitled expectation of traditional hierarchy. Though our relationship remained appropriately bounded by past patterns, This interaction indicated potential for communication based on reality recognition rather than manipulative agenda. As implementation of the inheritance plan progressed, its impact extended beyond financial expansion to conceptual evolution of the Foundation's work. Eleanor's intergenerational pattern documentation provided historical context that strengthened our educational approach, helping participants recognize that exploitative family financial patterns weren't just individual parental failures, but transmitted templates requiring conscious interruption. The inheritance also created opportunity to develop and model alternative approaches to resource transfer across generations, demonstrating possibilities beyond both traditional hierarchical distribution and complete individualistic separation. These models acknowledged legitimate interdependence while requiring transparency, consent, and equitable application rather than selective extraction disguised as cultural tradition or family necessity. 6 months after implementing these structural changes, the Foundation launched its expanded intergenerational financial ethics program, offering workshops, consultation services, and educational materials, helping families develop wealth transfer, approaches aligned with conscious values rather than unconscious patterns. The program attracted interest from diverse constituencies, including financial planners, family business consultants, and cultural organizations concerned with preserving legitimate traditions while preventing exploitation. What emerged through this process was deeper understanding of how financial relationships embodied core values about human worth, autonomy, and connection. Beyond practical mechanics of resource distribution, these relationships reflected fundamental beliefs about who deserved investment, whose contributions required compensation, and whether family connection entailed consent or coercion in resource sharing. Eleanor's unexpected inheritance hadn't simply provided expanded financial capacity, but catalyzed conceptual evolution in addressing the very patterns she had documented across generations. Her quiet observation and strategic resource deployment demonstrated alternative possibilities for translating financial capacity into purposeful impact, models we could now incorporate into educational frameworks, reaching thousands of families navigating similar terrain. The journals documenting her observations across decades provided invaluable historical context for patterns I had addressed primarily through contemporary manifestation and personal experience. This expanded perspective transformed our approach, from addressing individual family dysfunction to interrupting intergenerational transmission of exploitative templates, shifting focus from symptom to source with corresponding increase in potential impact. Perhaps most meaningful was recognition that Eleanor had transformed her own experience of witnessing favoritism and exploitation into strategic action that might help disrupt these patterns in future generations. Her approach paralleled my own, transformation of personal injury into educational protection, though implemented through different methods and timescales. This parallel suggested something profoundly motivational. The capacity to convert witnessed or experienced injustice into purposeful change wasn't merely individual resilience, but potential intergenerational legacy. Transformation of injury, not just into personal healing but into protection extending beyond individual lifespan or direct influence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.